Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello and good evening. My name is Dan Pfeiffer, and I'm thrilled to be back at the Commonwealth Club in person to moderate a program, and I'm so glad the club is returning to more in-person programs as the region starts to return from the pandemic. You can learn more about the club's in-person offerings on the club website at www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm particularly glad to be the moderator for tonight's program with the always thought-provoking Lily Geismar. Lily is a professor at Claremont McKenna College and the author of a wonderful new book, Left Behind: The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality. We're here to discuss this fascinating book, and I'm eager to jump into the conversation because it discusses some of the issues we often discuss on Pod Save America that I've written about in my time, how Democrats lost their way in fighting inequality and what this means for the party and the country, and how we get back to those roots. One final note, if you have any questions for Professor Geismar or me and are here in the room, please write them on a question card and they will be brought to me throughout the program. For those watching online, please post them in the YouTube chat box. Those questions will be brought to me as well. I can't wait to see how that happens. Okay, let's jump in, Lily. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. It's great to be here with you in person. I have not done a Commonwealth Club in-person event in more than 2 years, so this is very exciting. I'm very excited to be here with you.
Well, I'm so grateful to be here too in person, and also to be here with you, who I'm now learning is such a veteran of this stage. So
Yes, my side gig is Commonwealth Club. As an author, I try to pay forward. It's karma, right? It's pay it forward for book authors. But this is a fascinating book. I very much enjoyed reading it. Very excited to talk to you about it. But I want to start with just what led you to write the book? What got you interested in this topic and caused you to dedicate so much time and energy to this thesis?
Yeah, so that it is always a question when you're starting a book. What gets you into doing it? And there were a few different things. Number one, I'd written another book called "Don't Blame Us: Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party." And in working on that book, at the end, there was the last chapter of it is looking at Mike Dukakis, who's often seen as like the biggest loser in American politics, and he's actually really, really interesting. And I became interested in how Mike Dukakis started to embrace kind of market-oriented thinking, and especially the tech industry. And I started wanting to address that question of the Democrats increasingly using these ideas of the market in the 1970s and 1980s, and sort of thinking about that as a bigger story. So that book actually ends with the Democratic Leadership Council, which is a critical component of this project. The other thing that really I was thinking a lot about was where these ideas in the market come. And there's often this story about the Democrats, and especially under Bill Clinton, that the reasons that they embrace market-oriented thinking was in response to the Republicans. And so the Democratic Party, from the period sort of after 1968, is always told as a story of a weak party, always defensive. And I wanted to sort of challenge that thinking and sort of think about what they actually believed in, and why they became so invested in these market thinking. The third reason actually was from my vantage point as a professor, and that a lot of my students, especially in the period sort of around the 2010 to like 2014, were increasingly invested in these ideas, sort of private and market solutions to social problems, and especially sort of wanted to go into the private sector as a space to do good. And they all were Democrats. And so I was sort of wanted to think, like, why is this the way that such a generation of people have really come to sort of think in these ways? And so that led me to going back to the 1990s to understand that.
So to sort of set the table for this conversation, let's do a little sort of basic building block definition. So when you say market-oriented solutions, tell us what you mean and tell us what that is in contrast to.
Sure. So the idea of it's the idea of using the it works in a couple of different ways. One is to kind of literally use the private sector to do the work that was once under the domain of the public sector. So that's one way of thinking about what a market-oriented solution is. Another is to kind of use the mechanisms of the market. So techniques that we sort of think about that the private sector uses, particularly around efficiency, accountability, things that sort of that more business oriented solutions, but to address social problems. And what it replaces is the traditional means that liberalism or the Democratic Party operated in, which would be more focused on big government programs, government assistance, redistribution. Those is the kind of mechanisms through which you would address social problems.
And sort of the height of that latter form of government-oriented solution was, you would say, New Deal through Lyndon Johnson?
Yeah, so that's sort of that period, the sort of period we call it the kind of the New Deal or liberal consensus, that type of thinking. So that idea of kind of that the way to solve problems is through big government. And so Lyndon Johnson really, the Great Society is really seen as the kind of high watermark of that, of carrying on the ideas of the New Deal.
And there are a couple of different, within the course of your book, different sort of descriptions of types of Democrats, right? I want to sort of try to explain them and disentangle them for various people, because some of these terms are thrown around now in ways that I think may be somewhat misleading, both for what the word really means and how it replied back then. So let's start with New Democrat.
So the New Democrats, now I feel like I'm getting a quiz.
Yeah,
so it's like,
I know you know the answer, so yes.
What if I get it wrong? The New Democrats, are a term. So one of the things that's interesting, and we might get to the other terms that sort of build into this as well. There's the group of Democrats sort of from the 1960s. So like the New Deal, that's easy to define. If you want me to do that too.
No. I think we can agree on that one. I think. This is a very erudite audience. I guess.
Okay. So, the way that we think about there's these various different groups of Democrats who start to emerge, and the New Democrats are a group that kind of coalesce under the Democratic Leadership Council, which is this group of Democrats who are very committed to changing the direction of the party, and especially moving it much more to what they would call the political mainstream, or to the center of American politics. And so how they define themselves is that they were basically a new generation of Democrats who were going against those older programs of and older ideas of the Democratic Party, which were represented by the Great Society or the New Deal.
And then so neoliberals or neoliberalism is something that is thrown around a lot now, as you say in your book, on Twitter particularly. What does that mean, and how does that fit into this context?
So and I knew that's where we were going with this question. That's the hardest, in some ways, the term to define. And so in some ways, that was actually another core issue and question that I wanted to address in this book, is sort of thinking about the ways in which neoliberalism gets used. Because very often that is a term that is used, especially in places like Twitter, to describe the Clintons, and so it's used as actually a term about the Democrats, and that there's this conflation of kind of how we think about Bill Clinton to other kinds of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism as a philosophy traditionally actually has its roots in Friedrich Hayek and the right and Milton Friedman, and it's an idea that the kind of free market is the best mechanism through which, and limited government is the best way to bring about choice and individual freedom, and that's at its core of what neoliberalism is. The interesting question is that there was a group of Democrats actually in the early 1980s who then also adopt this term in a kind of a positive or affirmative way, that's how they were describing themselves, that they were new liberals, and that sort of evolves into New Democrat. One thing I aim to do through the book is actually to show that the version of neoliberalism that the New Democrats and the DLC and Clintons adopt is actually in some ways distinctive from the kind of traditional Milton Friedman style approach. That actually it's not as kind of the free market for the sake of the free market. Rather, they come to understand the market as a mechanism through which to achieve kind of traditional liberal goals, and especially to kind of address problems of inequality and bring more opportunity to people.
Okay, and who are the Atari Democrats?
So that's that is another kind of critical term that is also sort of attached to the around neoliberals. And so the Atari Democrats, there's actually I'll tell the story I'll tell this chronologically in some ways. So the other group that of all these terms, and one of the things that ends up happening in this group of Democrats who come into office after 1968 is actually there's like a decade where they can't figure out what to call them. So they're initially called the Watergate babies, and it's a huge group of Democrats are elected to Congress and to both to the Senate and also to gubernatorial races and governorships. They are called the Watergate babies because they came into office in 1974. They actually were in opposition in many ways, not less to Nixon and more to the Democratic establishment. They then, a lot of those people, and I'm just saying, it's people like Tim Wirth and especially Al Gore, who actually, he enters in 1976. They then get called the Atari Democrats. It's a term I love. It's actually Chris Matthews who comes up with it,
who at the time,
who
yes.
was, he was working for Tiff O'Neill, and he was like, they're nothing but a bunch of Atari Democrats. And what he was trying to imply by the term was their strong embrace of the tech industry and tech as a mechanism through which to address economic growth and opportunity.
Was this the moment when Al Gore invented the internet?
It's the same time.
Yes. Okay, good.
He also invented Atari.
Yes,
so
there you go.
It's so, and they actually, my favorite is that Tim Wirth said, "I wish you'd call us Apple Democrats. It sounds more democratic."
Yes.
And they actually do briefly embrace Atari Democrat, but then Atari moved its operations to I think it's like to Asia, and then they were like, we have to cut ourselves in that term. But I think I would, if I was a strategist, I would go with Atari Democrat.
Yes, but whether you're a Republican or a Democratic strategist, yes. So just to also set some context, your book was fascinating. It was truly fascinating to read. And it was very interesting for me to read because the period in which you cover up through the Clinton administration is largely before my active time in politics. My first campaign was Al Gore's presidential campaign, which is a campaign that he sort of famously ran, or at least ended, on the exact opposite of his Atari Democrat roots, where he sort of embraced the people versus the powerful as his slogan, and sort of some late stage, not, I think, entirely, perhaps authentically believed and authentically delivered populism at the end of that campaign. Many of the people in this book are friends of mine who I worked with in the Obama administration over the years, and also am someone who sort of grew up in politics aware, sort of in that Clinton era, sort of soured on it enough that I went to go work for the long shot person taking on the heir to the Clinton legacy. So the whole thing was very fascinating to look at from that perspective, and now from where we are today. But I want to get to your core, and also I generally have a sympathetic view of people in politics where all their decisions don't work out right. But you're sort of you wrote this book, as you said, to sort of test the idea that the centrism, market-oriented approach, however you want to look at it, of Clinton-era Democrats or 90s-era Democrats was not a product entirely or mostly of the limits the Republicans put on them, but was something born of their own ideology, their own beliefs. Help explain that, because that runs counter to the common understanding of that period, as told by a lot of the people in that period.
Yeah, I mean, and so this is one of the key things I wanted to get at, was that it's not just it's not to say that the era of Democrats from the 70s through the 2000s were working in this like frictionless world where there was no Republican Party, that they had a very powerful Republican Party they had to contend with. But I think that the strategy, especially in adopting this kind of market-based, market-oriented thinking, and especially the strong focus on growth, emerges largely from, I mean, in two ways, and this is where we get slightly arcane, but is in some ways in the crisis of Keynesian economic theory, that it just had broken down and they needed to find a new solution. And so that's the Atari Democrat term comes from that, of like, we need to figure out economic growth through what becomes called the new economy sectors of tech, finance, and especially and trade, and those can also solve the problems of poverty. And what I want to show in the book is that this isn't just defensive or strategic things that come up. I mean that at election time, that they really believed in this approach. They really believed that this would be a way both to sort of address. I mean, I use a lot of the language in the book of sort of doing well by doing good, that you could do both things at the same time, that you grow the economy and help poor people and low-income people. And that is really where a lot of this kind of what is now on Twitter called neoliberalism, where it comes from.
And sort of what's the context in which this generation of Democrats come to adopt this viewpoint? Is it a belief that the previous New Deal liberal consensus policies have failed, or no longer politically possible? Is it, how much of it's a response to Reaganism? Sort of, because it all happens at once, right? And what are the sort of I think related to that, what are sort of the flashpoints within the party about how this debate happens and plays out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of all those things. So it is this moment in the 1970s where the larger ideas of economic growth aren't working. There's also this sort of generational frustration with the way that where the party is. Another key piece of that is one of the other big critiques of this group, who then it's easiest to call them the kind of New Democrats, is against the Democratic Party's what they see as sort of capture by special interest groups, especially by organized labor, and they want to move away from that approach. So they see labor as a drag both on the economy but also on the Democratic Party.
And they being the
New Democrats.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's this fundamental sort of critique of that approach. And the moments that really sort of help to solidify this, I mean, and actually, I mean, this might be the kind of nerdy political historian in me.
That's why we're here.
Okay, so that's is that oftentimes the elections of the 1980s the Democratic side gets told as sort of like just complete failures, but they're actually really interesting moments of like alternative paths and opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so those to me are flashpoints that you have, and that in both of those primaries you actually had really competitive races, and that they actually stand for these kinds of different directions the party might have gone in, and you also see this kind of solidification of these particular values.
Is this 80 and 88?
I would say 84 and 88. I mean, 80 is an interesting election too, because you have Ted Kennedy as as a challenger. But in the 84 election, you have Gary Hart, who's like a classic Atari Democrat, Walter Mondale, who stands for this older version of the Democratic Party, and then you also have Jesse Jackson, who's this other alternative. And in the aftermath of that moment, after Mondale captures the nomination and then loses in a landslide, you have the founding of the Democratic Leadership Council. So that is this key moment. But also in 1988 is another moment of like a sense of kind of possibility of a lot of these different candidates, and then a sense of sort of failure, that there's a doubling down on a particular type of strategy and style. And I think that also leads to the emergence of Bill Clinton later, who does, and we can, I mean, I don't know if jumping forward to that, but I do think is really pivotal for bringing together a lot of these ideas, and being able to kind of, I think, to go back to your people versus powerless, I mean, he was able to sell that in a much more convincing way, and I think
Bill Clinton was.
Bill Clinton. I mean, I think that's like, so that idea of like sort of taking some of these market-oriented ideas and positioning them within a broader language of populism that was really effective politically. So that I see as a kind of key moment of really bringing a lot of these ideas into fruition. And then once the Clinton wins and in office, there's an opportunity to kind of implement a lot of these ideas.
And let's talk a little about the Democratic Leadership Council, because they are central to this whole endeavor. And if you were someone who started following politics, 8, 9, 10 years ago, you would have no concept of who they were or why that they were ever important. So let's talk about who they are and the role where they came from and the role they played.
Yeah. So and it is true that they've kind of fallen out, but there's a moment they have this real moment of power. The Democratic Leadership Council forms in the aftermath of the 1984 election of a group of these kind of members of Congress who want to shift the party towards more market-oriented thinking, and also a group of largely Southern moderate Democratic. That was a Freudian slip, I guess.
Yes.
The Democratic governors who want to move the party more towards the center. And they decide it's a group, they call themselves the Democratic Leadership Council. It's a group of politicians. It's a small group. It's led by the founding director was Al Gore, who's a congressional staffer, who takes Al Fromm. Did I say Al Gore? Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Again, I'm like okay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Al Gore is a founding member. He actually writes their first press release. And Bill Clinton's also a founding member, as is Joe Biden. And so it's primarily their early membership is all white men, largely from the South, and so they get assailed. Jesse Jackson famously calls them the Democrats the leisure class, and accuses them of trying to like suburbanize the party. And they after the 1980 election decide to like really double down and figure out a kind of strategy for the party to move it more towards the direction that they see. And one of the key things they write this memo called The Politics of Evasion that gets at these ideas, that the party needs to not sort of focus on trying to win over voters, people who are not voting basically, and marginalized groups, and instead focus on trying to win voters who've been shifting over to the Republican Party, largely moderate suburbanites. That's critical to their strategy. They also really focus on the presidency, that they say like the way for the Democrats to maintain power is to capture the presidency. So these politicians are part of it. And Bill Clinton is a founding member, but not critical. But then in 1990, they both really hone in on their ideology, which is they write this statement, and at the heart of it is the idea that the Democrats should be expanding opportunity, not government, largely through market-oriented mechanisms. And so that's really at the heart of like the sort of theory and philosophies that I'm interested in examining. And then they name Bill Clinton their director, and it's really their leader. It's really critical for his career too to sort of take on this role, and so that gives the combination of this kind of infrastructure plus Bill Clinton, then sort of boosts him into being able to capture the nomination in 1982, and so that's when they really reach their like peak of power too, because it sort of proves their theory that this is how this is the new direction of the party.
And Bill Clinton came to the DLC, if I have my time right, after he has won the governorship, lost the governorship, and then re-won the governorship. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So so Bill Clinton is this sort of
he's 32, I think.
He's 32. He actually ran in 1974 at like when he was 28.
Yes.
So he was a little bit older in 19. So but he won in 1978 the governorship of Arkansas. He loses his reelection, but they had 2-year races at that point, and then he re-wins in 1982. He's really committed to this approach of economic growth through the new economy, and also really wanting to find kind of new solutions to problems. So it has all these kind of new programs and policies that he's using to address poverty and inequality in Arkansas, and brings those to the DLC. And I'll say one thing that's actually really interesting. I interviewed Al Fromm and asked him about this. Is that like he shaped their platform and philosophy in a lot of ways. So it wasn't just that he was like their puppet or mouthpiece. Like he actually had a critical role, especially on welfare reform, which was something that he was really committed to. And so had been working on things like welfare to work in Arkansas in the 1980s, and sort of brings that to the DLC as like, we need to work on this more. And so makes that becomes another kind of critical fusion.
I asked the question about Bill Clinton losing because what is the political context, I think, is very interesting for the DLC and these members. So the Democratic Party, after having great success in the 30s and 40s, and then Kennedy, LBJ, loses 68-72, wins 76 in large part because the previous president was on the way to jail before his successor pardoned him, lose in 80. And in the South in particular, we are in the middle of the post-civil rights transition from the Democratic Electoral Coalition. A lot of what had been our base has left the party over Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act. And so you have a bunch of people like Gore and Clinton, who these were strong Democratic states always, where they're seeing this transition happening before them. And then Gore himself is someone, as I mentioned, I worked for, was someone incredibly motivated by the loss of his father's Senate seat in 80, I think, right?
No, doesn't he lose in? Oh, he loses in like 68.
Oh, 68. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're right.
it's-
Yeah, 68. Yeah. But like that is his, like he loses as
Yes.
being treated as a big government liberal. That really, it's sort of Al Gore's defining characteristic.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I mean, I would say this is a side note, but one of the things that's fascinating is like he's committed to his father's legacy,
Yeah.
but like using a different sort of political philosophy and strategy.
I also worked in the early 2000s for Evan Bayh, who succeeded Bill Clinton as sort of the face of the DLC, whose father did lose in 1980 to Dan Quayle, something that's very hard to get over, and then lived his life exactly like Al Gore, very similar, and they were very similar in lots of ways, but sort of trying to learn the lessons of his father's loss. I guess you could run this sort of psychological experiment for all. George W. Bush also ran his presidential campaign related to his father's loss. But I bring all that up to set the sort of the political context for how these decisions are made. But despite that political context, you argue that these are true beliefs. Like they believe these are the policy. This is not. These are not closet New Deal Democrats who are pretending to be Atari Democrats for the sake of getting elected. They have decided the party in terms of not just political strategy and messaging, but also policy agenda has not been updated to reflect the times. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean and that's actually one of their classic, the classic kind of New Democrat sort of statements is that like the solutions of the 30s are not going to meet the policies. They say this like the 70s, and they're like the 80s, the 90s. So that's like that's.
Yes. And then we're building a bridge to the 21st century.
Yeah.
Yes.
But there's this idea that like the old solutions are not working, and I do think they believed that. I think one thing that's really critical is like another thing of kind of thinking about this generationally is this is a group of and I'll use Al Gore and Clinton are like a good shorthand, but there are other critical figures and some of the other ones that you mentioned, who all they were all highly Ivy League educated, who also had this kind of faith in meritocracy, like a meritocratic, but also like technocratic approach. And I think that that's one thing that with the kind of faith in things like the market, that there was a sense that market solutions were more transparent, they're more efficient, and in a kind of technocratic view, that makes more sense. And so that is part of what they're thinking too, that these like outdated big programs. And I think that one of the things is that they believe that like the looking at the Great Society and those programs, like they didn't actually deliver all that much. Also, it's important, like especially use Clinton as an example, that the state of Arkansas in the 1980s was going through like severe economic hardship and transition. I mean, it was really feeling the effects of globalization early, and so he was looking for kind of new means to address the kind of real critical problems of the state. And I think the models that he adopts actually become seen as kind of this can be also work for the country too. But it's true that they do have a strategy behind it, their strategy, but that also there is a core philosophy that they do. I argue they do believe in.
And sort of the backdrop for a lot of that is a lot of the context they use is the war on poverty, right? And they point to, Clinton does this with Cabrini Green in Chicago, where examples of well-intentioned government programs established in the 60s did not deliver the sort of relief that it was promised, right? That poverty won the war on poverty, right? How does that play out in people's minds?
Well, that is I think that's part of it. And it's interesting, like someone like Al Frum actually got his start in the war on poverty. I mean, that's where he sort of had his political career and believed in certain ideas of it. But I think that's this idea that those big programs just they cost a lot of money and they didn't do the things they were set out to do. And there can be new ways to kind of to address these problems that won't be, I mean, I will say they both can actually help, but they also won't be as politically costly because there's another thing. I mean, the other people who were really harsh on the war on poverty and the Great Society were the Republicans at the time. So I do think there is, to not say that it wasn't entirely strategic, there is a component of that like we're going to solve the problems and we're going to sort of prove, we're going to prove we can sort of outrun the Republicans on some of that language.
In reading the book, it's obviously a very well-argued, substantive critique of the failures of New Democratic centrism, right? Clintonism, right? Clintonomics, however you want to talk about it. But I actually viewed it as a more sympathetic portrayal of that than I think is the common left critique of Bill Clinton.
Well, and thank you for saying that.
Yes.
No, because that actually was one of the things that it was to do both things, to like take it seriously, to understand like what it was. I really wanted to understand what it was trying to do. And I think that there is this left way of thinking about Clinton that doesn't actually do that, to sort of think about what they were trying to achieve. And so in some ways that was it to readers across the political spectrum to kind of understand that position. And I'll say another thing. I mean, so the book itself walks through a lot of these programs to address poverty around public housing, welfare reform, microfinance, microenterprise, which is really critical to the philosophy, and also around banking, and charter schools. I'm now like just listing them off in my head as we go through, but in some ways, I think what ends up happening is that there's an overselling of what these programs can do. So it's not to say that they're not. A lot of them actually are good ideas. They can't replace a social safety net. So that's like what I want to get at is that like, why did the sort of Clinton era Democrats become so interested in these kinds of programs? Could they accomplish? But also thinking about the fact that they were just really oversold in what they could accomplish.
And I think what I found made it seem sympathetic is, or more sympathetic than the traditional critique. So the traditional critique is, and I think some of it is fair, in a couple ways I'll mention, but the traditional leftist critique of Clintonomics is cynical political centrism, triangulation, running against Democrats. Some suggestions of, you hear this one a lot, about corruption, big money, friends with business, all of that is why we got these centrist policies. And your argument is, while there may be some cynicism there, and I think Bill Clinton's decision on welfare reform are pretty well documented, how the politics played into that. The bill he signed, not as supportive welfare reform over the years from Arkansas on, but that these were perhaps oversold, but genuinely, like they thought they were doing the right thing. It just didn't work out the way they thought.
Yeah, I think that is. I mean, that was one of the things, is to sort of understand that it wasn't solely this sense of like, we're just gonna. I mean, I think because that is the argument of triangulation, like this deep cynicism that like we'll like beat them at their own game. And I think that misses the sort of what it tried to do. And to me, it like, you could say, I mean, and I think that there are many people who argue this, like intent doesn't matter, it's just about the outcome. But to me,
right.
Intent actually does matter, because it shows, I mean, in some ways it can do two things. One is sort of, it shows that this, in some ways, this philosophy has much more power beyond that moment. So it's trying to understand that thing. But I think also it can obscure some of the some of the consequences too. So in some of the kind of really blanket statements of saying like this is all bad, you actually it misses some of the nuance of what they did or didn't do.
And so if I was a person who worked for Bill Clinton or worked in the Democratic Party in the 90s, I would probably respond to this and, probably agree with, obviously some things, and we can get into financial deregulation that had grave consequences. And every president makes decisions. Some of those decisions work out. Some of them, in hindsight, end up looking horrendous. But would say this was the period of greatest, it wasn't perfect, but was the period of greatest economic prosperity since the New Deal. And so when we did that despite a divided Congress for the all but the first 2 years of the presidency. So, shouldn't we get some credit here?
Well, I think there's a question about that. And so so the side of the kind of the growth model that the first, the Watergate babies, Atari Democrats, the New Democrats are promoting, the Clinton administration really does implement, and that does lead to the kind of growth that they that they hope, beyond what I think they were actually anticipating it to do. And so in the kind of particular kinds of promotion of these critical sectors, I would argue that, and I think that this is the point, and many people I interviewed for the book made that to me, and they said from the Clinton administration, like there's this idea that like look at the growth, look what happens after, like this is this critical moment, and I think that's right, like, and in the moment of like really the roots of polarization emerging. if not emerged. What I would say is that while that happened, it's also left the economic scale became increasingly unequal by the end of the 90s, and then especially beyond, which has its legacy and has its roots in this period. And I think one of the things that it did, the two parts of it, to me, that it left low income and poor people in a much more vulnerable position. So there might have been overall economic growth, and there was like a sense of prosperity, but in a lot of the programs of replacing, so welfare to work or welfare reform is like a critical one of thinking about it, that you have a replacement of this New Deal program that's a safety net with the idea of a job, and I look at also this promotion of like entrepreneurship as a potential solution too, and that leaves people without this kind of critical safety net when things go wrong. And so one of the things about what happens in welfare reform in particular is that it was to implement that program in a time of prosperity when there were lots of jobs available sort of worked, but then once jobs weren't available, you have all these people who can't get access to the jobs that they need to get any kind of support. That is really important. And then I think it also, because of the ways in which so much of the Clinton era growth is built on these policies of deregulation and competition, that it left poor and low-income people much more open to the kind of instabilities and also, frankly, to predation from the market. So you lose the kind of protections of kind of separating the public and private sector from each other. And part of the programs also were this idea of sort of saying to corporations, like, look at this market that's available to you. Like, so Bill Clinton went on these tours to kind of bring Walgreens executives to low-income communities, and so there's one of the things that happens is like those companies they will move there to kind of provide jobs or to make a profit, but like they don't have any obligation in the same way the government does. So once they decided that particular places weren't profitable, they could just leave. The other piece of it is that and the darker view of it is that it opened up for predation by, especially by the mortgage and housing industry, that leads to the mortgage crisis, like that has the direct consequences that are the mortgage crisis less than a decade later.
I think those specific examples are very important because you could sit here and say, yes, we didn't make all the right decisions. Yes, the prosperity was not as broadly shared as we'd like, but inequality is going up around the world because it's not just the United States, right? It's going up around the world because of globalization, because of changes in technology, the sort of the quality jobs, either in the United States or abroad, that we sort of think of as quality blue collar union jobs are disappearing, and so this is where we are. But you're honing on these specific decisions that exacerbated the trend. It's not, in my mind at least, fair to say that Bill Clinton, or as I would obviously defend Barack Obama, failed to solve the inequality problem. Like, that is not a solvable problem that one president can do. But what are the decisions that people made that exacerbate the trend? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, and I think that is this issue. And I even say this in the book, like to blame all of this on. I think there's two parts. Like, to blame all of this on Clinton, or to say that someone like Barack Obama or Joe Biden could fix everything is unfair. Like, it's too much to put on one thing. Especially these are deep structural problems. But there are key choices. They were operating within a sense of choices, and they made deliberate choices in Clinton and during the Clinton era, and that lead to the kinds of inequities that get seen. And I don't, it's beyond me to say that and I don't think, it's not to say like Bill Clinton foresaw that like there was going to be a huge foreclosure crisis, and a lot of those problems became much, much more intensified under the Bush administration and their acceleration of a lot of those kinds of forms of deregulation, and then also even further shrinking the social safety net from what it was. But I do think that those kinds of things did end up leaving poor and low-income people in a much worse place. I think the other issue is that this idea of kind of using growth as a solution, it didn't actually ask for very many sacrifices from, so if you say like corporations can do something, it's not then asking them to make very many sacrifices. And so that's the other thing, like it's not tied with like higher taxes or other types of things that could sort of go along with that. And that also contributes to the kind of inequities that become borne out by the end of the 1990s and then really seen over the last 20 years.
You know, some of the, a lot of your book, and I think there are some, Bill Clinton is an inherently political animal. He famously or notoriously consumes polling, and after that first loss in the governor's race, he signs up with Dick Morris, who eventually and then replaces or brings along Mark Penn, another famously cynical pollster who would go on to also advise Donald Trump in some way, shape, or form. But you tell a lot of your book focuses on the people who worked for Bill Clinton, who came up in the DLC, Al Frum, Bruce Reed, Elaine Kamarck, these folks. And I think some of these people are friends of mine. And I think what some of them would say, and probably said to you, is, yes, we are not traditional New Deal Democrats. We think, the solution of the 30s, 40s, 50s all work for the whatever decade we're in now. But we would, in a different political environment with a different Congress, and frankly, a different congressional Democratic Party, we would have had a greater mix of the two, right? Like Bill Clinton's 92 platform is a little bit more, I think, of it's obviously framed in, very Atari Democrat terms, but he also is running on universal health care. Right. And then it's part of his famous James Carville things he writes down. Don't forget about healthcare is number 5 on the principles of the campaign. And is this a different picture if they don't lose Congress in 94? We don't get the Contract for America. Just is there an alternative version of history that is, even if it's still overly reliant on market-based solutions, has more of a mix?
I think there probably would be. I think the other thing that happened, and it's also to the fact that, and this was something that came to really interest me in the book, was the lack of political opposition from the left pushing on Bill Clinton. Yeah. And so I think that to me, and I think that's another moment that's like different than today, that you didn't, that I pointed out that like in the 80s, there was these kind of different alternative paths of the party. By the it seems to me that by the and I think it's after healthcare, it's after 1994 really, then the sort of real failures, that all of these kind of pressure groups on the left, they push on certain issues, but there's not this kind of unified left opposition. So I think that also having that might have pushed things in a different direction too. So it's less, I think that there's political pressures, and we can see it with, I do think that today Biden is having to contend with an outspoken, not fully unified, but more unified left wing of the party, and having to address those in politics in a way that Bill Clinton did not in after 1996. I mean, there's that's another place to me. So that I think that also pushed him in various different ways. And it is true. I think that there are certain things that they gave up, and even on a lot of the market-based stuff, like on things like domestic microenterprise, he wanted to do more with it and didn't, because it was just sort of this isn't going to work in the ways that we want it to, and I want to push for other things instead. Or empowerment zones is another example. They couldn't put the money into it that they wanted to actually make it a really effective program they want it to be.
There's a lot of interesting parallels between the period you write about and where the Democratic Party is now. I mean, you reference the Politics of Evasion report written for the DLC. It was a very famous report, which I actually to give people a little bit of summary of. But notably, the authors of that report reissued an updated version of it just a couple of months ago. So we're this debate about should we try to win back the people we've lost? The conversation is now a little more rural area than it was suburban in the course of the 80s. And now, and so let's talk a little bit about the Politics of Evasion, and then I want to try to draw some parallels to the moment we're in now.
Sure, and I would be I would be interested in hearing your thoughts too on the parallels. So the Politics of Evasion is this it's a post-mortem memo written by Elaine Kmark and Bill Galston, two political scientists, that the DLC commissions, and it argues that really that the party should not focus, like the Jesse Jackson approach is not a good approach for the Democratic Party, that the party should not be focused on trying to get sort of not who they define as non-voters of basically underrepresented groups, people of color, women, low-income voters into the party, and instead it's to focus on these kinds of the people that they see as kind of reliable swing voters.
Reagan Democrats.
Reagan Democrats and moderate, sort of moderate suburbanites who in like Sunbelt states, and that is really where the party's future lies. And I do think, I mean, it was interesting to me because I was finishing working on this book in 2020, and like that conversation is it is this thing that like it's very unresolved within the Democratic Party. And I do think it speaks to these deeper, just sort of fundamental tensions that have to do with strategy, but do have to do with policy too, because in some ways, like the kinds of things you're promising that you're going to do get affected by which of those two approaches you adopt. And so that would be I would be curious on your thoughts about it.
I mean, it's interesting because the answer then and now is both. We don't actually have a choice. And it's actually more true now because of the Republican Tilt Electoral College, where to win the presidency, a Democrat has to appeal to a large number of voters who are more conservative than the median Democrat. It's just, as long as unless people start moving out of this state and heading to Wisconsin, that's a problem that is going to continue for a long time. But what is, I think, interesting, the other parallel I saw between the 92 election and the 2020 election is, in 1992, it is impossible to overstate how desperate the Democrats were to win. That was whether it was Kennedy and Carter in 80, whether it was Jackson and Hart, or Jackson and Gephardt to a little bit of a lesser extent in 88. There were these, the New Deal versus Atari Democrat thing was the course of the debate. And it's unfair to put the mantle of liberalism on Jesse Jackson in 1984 in America. But that was the battle, right? And then we, as a party, we lost in 80. We got killed in 84. We lost to George H.W. Bush, who we generally, was a person who'd been on the cover of Newsweek as the wimp fat, just like we kept losing. And so in 1992, it was like 2020, and in some ways the candidates might have wanted to talk about policy, but the voters wanted to talk about electability. And that was sort of Bill Clinton's strength.
Well, I think that absolutely was the strength. I think the question, I mean, there is this issue then about, I'll say one thing about that. I mean, I agree. Like, I think that Bill Clinton, especially in his 1992 campaign, was a really, really effective candidate and an effective mouthpiece. And one of the things the DLC did see in him is that he could speak to multiple constituencies because he could capture the South. He also had these kind of liberal roots that, as we were talking about, become increasingly sort of sublimated over.
He'd come out of the McGovern campaign.
Yes, so that was this idea that he was a McGovernite. He had those ties. He could have these multiple kind of audiences, and so that made him a really, really effective candidate. And I think it's I think one of the problems, and especially with the DL, this is more of a Democratic strategy question, but the DL. I think one of the reasons I think the DLC sort of becomes why people who started following politics 10 years ago might not have heard of them is that it could be that they were victims of their own success, but also this problem that they were so beholden to the Bill Clinton strategy, and that he's a very unmatchable candidate in many ways. So that kind of holds them. The other thing I would say I think has been a real problem about the approach there, and this goes back to the politics of evasion, as I think I alluded to it earlier, is that it's really focused on the presidency, and I think that actually becomes the Democratic Party's, the Democratic Party's strategy from 1988 onward. So it's great that it wins in 1992, but the problem is that there's all the investment goes to the presidency, and so becomes a lack of kind of investment at the congressional level, at the state and at the local level that has also been
a devastating effect. And it's in part, I think, because the view was at the time that the Democrats had held the House since the 40s or whatever it was at that point, and it survived Reagan, like even in years where Republicans were winning 46, 48 states, Democrats were holding the House. So we had the House, and then the Senate was going back and forth every couple of years, just sort of in reaction to whoever had won or lost the presidency. And so they sort of put, but to your point, that obviously has had devastating effects up and down the ballot, everywhere else. But the other thing that I think affected Bill Clinton, is sort of the DLC and Bill Clinton, was not, the world also changed dramatically. Like the end of, like if you sort of trace the period you're talking about is the 80s through January 20th, 2001, when Bill Clinton leaves office. And obviously the way he left office, his last few years were mired in scandal. The departure from office was messy, to say the least. And then the entire world changed 9 months later on 9/11, which moved a lot of, I think, the sort of things that the DLC had pushed for way down the list of concerns for voters, right?
Yeah, and I think that is this moment of like that question of like what's similar and what's different,
Yeah.
and sort of thinking about that as this kind of mark periodization. I mean, I would say the other thing that's really fascinating too is like the ways in which I think it's a lot because of that issue of like what changed. And so one of the other things is that all these all these economic sectors also are changing dramatically over the course of the 1990s, and that also becomes borne out. So like the tech is emerging in different kinds of ways. And so, I mean, having to sort of contend with that, coupled with things like the real effects of globalization, and then like the banking sector changing. So also, there's something in the book of like matching the poverty programs to these sectors that are just changing rapidly. Also has the effect. So that goes back to the question of like where inequality comes from. That those are changing. So that's another place that you have this key difference.
We have some audience questions here. Weren't there some successes in the Clinton administration? And obviously there were, and you write about some of them in the book, but if there were a couple that you would point to, even if they were successful, are there successful examples of their market-based approach?
Yeah. So some of the places that it can be seen as effective, and this is one that's smaller. So one of the things that the book tracks is, and we didn't talk about really, is this program called, this community development banking program called Shore Bank that emerges in Chicago from the neighborhood of South Shore, actually, where Michelle Obama is from, that was addressing using commercial banking to help do economic development. And it's a really interesting program that Bill Clinton learns about in 1980, early 1980s in Arkansas, and brings to Arkansas, and then it becomes he really promotes it and sells it. I mean, it's fallen out of the kind of historical narrative, but it was a huge part of his campaign in 1992, and he does implement a program to make that part of the federal government it's the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. It's a real mouthful. They needed a better term for it. It's called the CDFIs. And those are, I think that it's a really, there's a lot of potential to that program. They've actually gotten a lot more attention during both in the sort of aftermath of 2008, but especially during the pandemic, as providing sort of critical relief to people. It's been an issue that even during the Clinton era, they pushed for more funding for, but it's been critically underfunded. And to me, that's a sign of kind of a successful program that's sort of been implemented into government and is a legacy that lives on.
How much of the new Democrat school of policy thinking is influenced by academic debates like the University of Chicago School versus the political will of the country?
I think it's a combination that Clinton did bring in. I mean, there's a whole group of academic thinkers. There's an argument actually, and this is not mine, but there's someone who wrote a book called Liberalism Reinvented, or I can't think of the full title. Stephanie Mudge, she teaches at UCSD. No, it's UCS. Yes, UC. Yeah, is that right?
San Diego?
No, Davis. Sorry, UC Davis. Sorry. She argues that a lot of the people who are Clinton economic policy thinkers are actually not academics, and so that actually affects kind of some of the political thinking.
Like this is the Gene Sperling.
Yeah, well, Gene Sperling. I mean, he doesn't have a degree in economics, but even Rubin's not an economist, so you have a different brand of kind of thinking going forward. I think that. So I don't think they were. I think Bill Clinton was aware of a lot of those debates. I mean, that goes to sort of his awareness of sort of thinking about these types of things, but is not like, that goes to the thing of like the neoliberalism is not like this, like we're going to adopt these theories wholesale and bring them in. It's more kind of what do we think will work in this particular moment?
There's another, it was like a lot of this book that really made me think of sort of like the sliding doors moments here, right? Like you've written a lot about Michael Dukakis. The interpretation of Michael Dukakis' loss. Democrats are very bad at understanding why we lost elections, and we tend to pick one reason, and it's often the wrong one, and then we build the entire party strategy around that. But the sort of view was Michael Dukakis was a soft on crime liberal. And so we needed something the opposite of that. But Michael Dukakis was sort of an Atari Democrat in a lot of ways.
Oh, he's huge. I mean, so,
Yeah.
and this goes to my first, like in my first book. I mean, I think actually like and it's interesting. He was not a member of the DLC, and like they will concede that like he actually shared a lot of their policies.
Yeah.
I mean, Bill Clinton gave his nomination speech at the convention.
Famously, boringly so. Yes.
Like the worst speech. I think he says
Yes.
like the worst speech he ever gave.
It was,
but, like,
played off the stage like he had just won like the award for writing in a short form documentary at the Oscars. Like,
I actually wanted to find. I couldn't find it on the.
it's on
internet.
YouTube somewhere.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll dig.
I'm sure
I'll
the
dig-
Clintons have done a lot of work to try to erase it, but the internet is a powerful thing. Yeah.
I tried to look on C-SPAN. I couldn't
Yeah.
find it. So that's like that. It shows that if you can control C-SPAN, I guess
Yes,
you really
yes.
you can really get in there. But but that, I mean, so I think that Dukakis is this kind of moment. And the interesting thing about Dukakis too, to Jimmy, the wimp factor is also George H.W. Bush was not a great candidate.
Yeah.
And Dukakis was actually up in the polls by like 7. He was up by 7 points, I think, in July.
Yeah.
So he actually was a competitive candidate because of the ways he was selling these ideas of like economic growth and kind of, I mean, his thing was competency, not ideology, or and that like that's not a great slogan. So I think but that captured what he would have aimed to do. And there is a question of him like being a more successful candidate. He also, this goes more to my first book, which is about suburban liberals, but he was a voter who did really well with suburban voters and was actually critical to winning over a lot of swing voters, especially in northern affluent suburban states.
And the other sort of interesting sort of way to think about this is Bill Clinton is perhaps one of the least, with the exception of Donald Trump, most unlikely presidents in American history. He probably only won that primary because every other person who was a famous, powerful Democrat decided not to run. Joe Biden did not run. Al Gore did not run. And famously, Mario Cuomo did not run. And so in a different world, Bill Clinton does not win that primary. But also, he also arrived, and this is, I think, one thing that's a point of sympathy for the Clinton folks. He also arrives in the White House as the weakest president in history because he gets, whatever it is, 43% of the vote in a race he may not have won, although everyone who works for Bill Clinton will say otherwise, may not have won without Ross Perot doing so well as a third-party candidate, right? So there's a world in which we do not, it wasn't like the 1992 election it elected a Democrat, which is something we very much wanted, but it wasn't an overwhelming national consensus for new Democratic, Atari Democratic market approached policies, essentially, right?
Yeah, I think that's a thing too. And that was not, there wasn't a sense, and there was, I mean, and there was fraught, I mean, after, famously with things like the Sister Soldier moment, there was like fraught, there wasn't a uniform support amongst the Democrats.
Yeah.
Even. Like it wasn't like I don't think there was the same. And I was young when I don't fully remember. I like vaguely remember Bill Clinton being elected in '92, but like there wasn't the kind of energy like when Obama won that amongst like wide groups. I don't think there was the same. It didn't have the same kind of attention amongst kind of people who define themselves as Democrats in the same way. And I think that's right. I think it's interesting because they do come in with a sense of a stronger sense of a mandate than that, but did not have the kind of political, didn't have the kind of deep political support. So I actually think it's amazing. I mean, that goes to the other question of successes. One thing I learned from doing this having never worked in an administration, and Cheryl Cashin, who I interviewed for the book, is a professor at Georgetown Law School who worked in the Clinton administration, made this point to me too, is that you really only have 6 months to get things done. I mean, so there are two things I was found really fascinating. One is that the period of getting coming up with policy ideas after you win, after Clinton won to coming into office, that you have to basically came out with a blueprint of this is what we have to do, and that was fascinating to me. But also you can't get there's like such a narrow window of actually getting things accomplished. And I think that's happened in so many administrations too. So I do think they understood that they had to do a lot really fast.
And their more populist, more traditional ideas ran afoul of other Democrats, right? The elements of their first budget were killed because John Breaux killed the BTU, the energy tax in there. I mean, we're telling a different story about Bill Clinton and inequality if his healthcare bill passes in '94. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that's another moment of like that is this question of the counterfactual too.
Yeah.
Like what would have happened if that, like what would have happened with that as well? I mean, and so I do think that is really critical. And I do think that's another thing to the point of like the Democratic Party itself did look different in 1982 than it does in 2022 as well.
And so as we're sitting here today, Joe Biden is president, the Democrats have the House and the Senate. To what extent, and you can take this obviously back to the Obama administration, but to what extent do this sort of new Democrat market-oriented approach still infect how the party thinks about solving problems like inequality and unemployment and the general problems in our economy?
I think that in some ways, like its cultural effect doesn't have the same thing. So I always say this, like this goes to both places, but I guess because my narrow window is like spending time with my students, like there's not the same euphoria for market-oriented thinking. Yeah. You didn't hear as much of it. I mean, actually, Cory Booker was the person who most pushed it in the Democratic primary. It didn't really take hold in the same way. So I don't think there's the same energy for these kinds of approaches. Like microenterprise was not like at the heart of Biden's agenda for how he was going to solve problems. I do think the growth part is. I mean, there's still this idea of like promoting growth in various different ways. So in some ways, like the overt promotion of these policies is no longer sort of driving party message or the kind of political speeches. But I do think it has influenced like large scale policy issues in various different ways. And I do wonder this question too of like that. I think there's less there's a recognition that these ideas are just not they're not as effective both in terms of policy, but also I just don't think they have the same kind. They've come to hold the same kind of political power that they once did. That there's a sense like what I argue in the book is I think that one of the things this approach did is to actually alienate a lot of low income and poor people from the Democratic Party. That like Bill Clinton did not deliver the things that were expected that was sort of set out to do by what the market could do, and so either people stopped voting, or I think many turned to Trump and the Republican Party as selling something else. I think a lot of young people, like increasingly sort of see this as not the approach, that they're not as invested in this is the way we're gonna sort of get security. They don't want to, like they want the sort of security of a real social safety net, and that has been borne out too.
In a weird way, the Democratic Party is probably more divided along the axis that you write about than it was in the 90s, because as you point out, particularly after 95, 96, there isn't anyone pushing to Bill Clinton's left for a traditional solution. Obviously, you have Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, certainly a lot of people in the House of Representatives who are pushing what I think would fit in the modern day 2022, whatever year this is, version of that, which is Medicare for all. It's canceling student debt. It's a lot, some of the programs of which Biden embraced in his Build Back Better agenda around childcare and family leave and those sorts of things. But there is like that debate is still like that was I mean, in some ways the entire conversation has actually shifted left since the 90s. If you think like the polls of the debate around healthcare were a single payer plan based in Medicare and adding a government option to the already existing program, that's a pretty, relative to the discussion of the 90s, a pretty left agenda. But I'm curious how, when you look at Biden, because what I think is really notable is that some of the major characters in your book are sitting in the Oval Office with Joe Biden right now. Bruce Reed's the senior advisor. Gene Sperling is overseeing I think, the American Rescue Plan at this exact moment, but is also, I think, knowing Gene, a very active advisor to the president. There's probably more senior people from that 92 campaign working in this White House than worked in Obama's, at least in the beginning. Right?
Yeah, I think that that's right. And so, I mean, that's always, and I wonder, that is a question, like, and I think that this goes also.
And just related to that, I just want to ask this before we run out of time. And where does Biden fit in here? Because he actually was, I should have asked this earlier, but Biden was in the center of Democratic Party politics this entire period, right?
Well, and that's, I mean, so I'll say, I'll answer the second question first.
Yeah.
I mean, so Biden is a founding member of the DLC, and actually it's interesting because they, in 1988, there's like a very crowded primary, and they decide not to back him. They back Al Gore because they don't think he doesn't believe in their message as much. And they think he's too much of a maverick that they just don't trust him. But I think that actually speaks to something about that he doesn't, as I read Biden, he doesn't have, and his evolution, he doesn't have the same kind of core ideological, sort of commitment that I see in someone like Bill Clinton. And I think that this is something so we just talked about the 92 election and how there is this, it wasn't ideal, but I do think that the DLC saw it as a chance to kind of move the party. That's what they're committed to. I don't think, Biden, he explicitly said, I represent the Democratic, the will of the Democratic Party, and I say that as a critical difference. He's moved with the party, or at least, and he's another person, it's hard to know what he actually, at this point, firmly believes, but I think he believes he's the mouthpiece of the Democratic Party, and it's say. The big carve out on that is crime, and I do think the State of the Union was really interesting for that, because that has been a core issue of his. I mean, and that's where he saw overlap with the DLC and with Clinton in various different places. I mean, being critical of the 94 crime bill, and I think, as I read parts of the State of the Union, he's returning to that idea. So I think that's a place that he's evolved in some ways as representing as an interesting representative of where the party has gone, and its own divisions in some capacity. To the question of the advisors, I mean, and this is also where sort of, to me, strategy and policy go in various different ways. And I think that there has been a sense that it could be an adaptation that these other ideas just didn't work in the ways that we wanted to, and we need to find the solutions of maybe it's the solutions of the 90s aren't going to meet the problems of 2022. And I do think there's that part. My one concern is that a lot of these ideas did seem to sell politically, and so there's in a moment of kind of this crisis of 1980, what's going to happen in the midterms, that there's a return, a sense of return to that. But I do think, as far as I've seen it, there has been a sense that we cannot go back to what happened under Bill Clinton as a solution to addressing the kind of real economic crises that the United States is in right now.
I think that's right, because I think there's not a political appetite for it. The makeup of the Democratic Party has shifted dramatically in that 30 year period now since 92. And so who we're reaching, and then the scale of the problems, 92, the 90s were this weird period of calm-ish prosperity compared to what came before, and certainly what the next 22 years would look like with 9/11, the financial crisis, et cetera. The thing I wanted to say, just that is interesting, is from the perspective of someone who has been in that building and sort of in these decisions, that people who make the decisions are more complicated than, not just the presidents, but the advisors. Like Gene Sperling is someone who's very associated with Clintonomics. He's kind of branded it. And Gene is actually one of the biggest liberals I know, right? He came from Mario Cuomo. He went from Mario Cuomo to Bill Clinton. And Bruce Reed, who a lot of the left loves to attack, and they sort of really try to torpedo his role as being OMB director, came up with probably Barack Obama's most progressive tax policy idea for the State of the Union in 94. So there is this sort of set of complications here. I'm curious, there is a chance that there's going to be another and this can be our last question, I'll close this, but there's a chance there's going to be another Democratic primary in a couple of years, right? If President Biden were to decide not to run, but if that does not happen, then soon after we will have another big grand debate ideologically about where the party should go. What do you want to see in that debate? What's the or what do you want to see in it? What would give you some fear about it? But where do you think this all goes from here?
Well, I think in some ways, I don't think it's a return to what was like, and definitely not to like the Clinton era, but a return to I always try to impart when I teach my students, like, it's like, we don't want like to go back. There were a lot of problems with the New Deal. So it's not like, let's just like bring back the New Deal and like but I think it is a way of kind of thinking about the fact that there are many Americans who are facing a real sense of insecurity economically, like in all fronts, and that the Democratic Party can represent and deliver those kinds of ideas. I think one thing that and I do think this is happening that's really important is that. Another place that the DLC was actually really successful is basically in marginalizing the labor from the Democratic Party. It's amazing how little the labor movement got mentioned. I mean, even in like presidential campaign. I mean, I think they're still like going behind the scenes, but like as like I'm gonna like be behind labor, and I think that Biden has had to do that as the labor movement has been much more resurgent. So I think bolstering that, supporting that would be really critical for a candidate. And I do think kind of coming back to it, this sense of like the power of separating out the public and private sectors from each other. I mean, not trying to turn to the private sector to do what is actually the responsibility of government, and giving people a sense of stronger security. So that would be what I would like to see from a Democratic Party, and hopefully that like you'd have the majority of candidates representing that message, and not this kind of this fraught tension.
Yeah, it is. One of the things that's definitely changed since, and this is driven especially true since 2008, but was changing slowly over time for the 90s, is the 90s were a period where we celebrated business and business leaders, right? It was Steve Jobs and Lee Iacocca and Jack Welch, and all these people were on TV all the time, and and that sort of came out of the 80s, and that's not a thing that happens in the same way. Like, there is a great national skepticism of business. Like, business is in many cases, like big business corporations is as unpopular as Congress in many studies, and that's definitely not popular. So it seems unlikely that you would, I think in the near term, you would have a Democrat. Like, that is now actually, Democrats being seen as anti-business was one of its greatest weaknesses in the 80s, which has sort of led to the view that sort of market-oriented approach was an electable approach. And now being seen as pro-business is the Republicans' greatest political weakness, and so that dynamic has shifted.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. I mean, it is fascinating, like putting not money where the mouth is of like supporting. I mean, I think the hard thing is like the influence that money can have, and I didn't look at that in this book necessarily, but I think that is this kind of question that like the distancing. I mean, that you don't have like the same promotion. I mean, Bill Clinton was constantly out with Bill Gates and other figures, and I think Obama actually did that to some degree too.
We did, yeah.
and that has shifted, and so it'll be interesting to see how that actually maps onto not just messaging, but like to policy too.
Well, Lily, thank you so much. This is all the time we have for in today's program. I want to thank everyone who joined us here in person and online for this important Commonwealth Club program. Please make sure to pick up a copy of Lily's book, Left Behind: The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality, either here after the program or wherever you purchase your books. This program and others like it will soon be online at the club's website. Once again, I'm sure you can figure this out, but www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Dan Pfeiffer. This Commonwealth Club program is now adjourned. I feel like I should have a gavel for that, but yeah.